Welcome to the Provider's Report, where we delve into the world of value-based healthcare. Our mission is to empower healthcare providers with the knowledge and tools they need to deliver exceptional patient care. Each episode, we explore best practices, innovative strategies, and real-world examples of how to achieve the highest standards in patient communication and outcomes. Join us as we transform the future of healthcare, one conversation at a time.
Hey guys, welcome to Better Doctor Project, where we interview healthcare providers to tap into their experiences so we can turn our challenges into our biggest strengths. We hope today's episode inspires you to take that next step to become who you want to be in practice. I'm Dr. Beck.
And I'm Dr. Mack.
Let's get started.
Hey guys, it's Dr. Mack, and I'm so excited that you're back to finish that conversation that we started 2 weeks ago in regard to patient-initiated sexual harassment. If you haven't listened to that episode 10 yet, don't miss out. You will want to go back and hit play on it right now. At the end of last episode, Dr. Lee got a little philosophical with us in such a true way about some of the ways that we think differently as men and women, and our socially constructed models that shape the way we think about what kind of commentary is acceptable or welcome. In this episode, we jump straight in to focus more on the role men can play as a supervisor or colleague, in addition to figuring out how they can handle sexual harassment, because let's face it, ladies, they get it too, a lot more than you might think. I think oftentimes there are a few fundamental differences when thinking about these situations. One is perceived threat, which is physically different, as males are less likely to feel physically threatened by females for biological reasons. And two, there's a weird inverse relationship for women of being attractive and being smart. Like you can't have both. Versus men who can more easily be perceived as being attractive and smart. Like, did you see my hot doctor? He's really attractive too. It's an addition. It's an added bonus. Or a perception that a female's ideas or abilities are less valuable if she has strongly attractive features. So often there are comments like, well, maybe she got that job because of her looks. How these two things are related beats me. Regardless, somehow, these concepts have evolved, and it's our job to understand them, challenge them professionally, and create a positive shift in our interactions. So let's jump in. So I want to touch on something you just said, Dr. Lee, a second ago, which was about those philosophical differences between men and women and how we're raised. And for all the male providers that are listening right now, what are some things that they can do to help their colleagues, to help their employees, et cetera, who are females feel more comfortable? I know we talked about supporting and making an environment where it's easy to report situations like that. It's easy to document them. It's easy to get that support. But how exactly, like, what are some tangible action steps that providers listening can take, especially male providers, to make this whole process more comfortable for women and actually the men in their office when they experience things like this as well? Because we can't ignore that happens also.
So the way this actually got started and the way Dr. Lee and I got, interested in this topic and how much information was out there was I was actually, I was a fellow at VA Connecticut, and Dr. Lee was the current resident. And I was helping out in clinic one day, and I saw a patient, and he had said a few, inappropriate comments while we were in the clinic, in the office. And I just didn't respond. I just didn't feel like it that day. It wasn't my patient. It was the only time I was ever going to see him. And so as we were leaving, he walked in front of my my fellowship director and Dr. Lee's residency director, and said that he would come back more often if he got to see the hot doctor or the beautiful doctor or something about my looks. And our director looked at him and he goes, "She's a doctor and you will show her respect or you won't come back," or something along those lines. And we were both sitting there, and, afterwards we had voiced how grateful we were to have a director who supported us without question. Like, we didn't even have to ask him. And even after that, he would ask us, like, was that okay the way that I handled that? Like, I probably should have let you handle it, or I just want to check in to make sure it's okay if I step in. I just didn't want him to make comments like that. It wasn't appropriate. And he directed the comment at me. And we are curious, how many people don't have that opportunity. So I think, having the conversation ahead of time, or even after, if it's in the moment and you've never had the conversation before, to address it and support that female if she's not saying anything or she looks uncomfortable, or, if it's two associates who are working in the same office and it's the male's patient who's saying something to the female provider as he's passing her in the hallway, or saying something behind closed doors. That's happened before as well with our previous resident, Dr. Jonathan Free, who saw a patient after I had seen a patient, and the patient had made a comment about my looks, and Dr. Free said, that's not appropriate to talk about her looks. Let's talk about what kind of care she provided you. So I think that even behind closed doors, making statements, showing support, standing up for the females who are in your clinic, your staff, or the other providers, students, if they're rotating through, goes a long way. Or at least checking in with them afterwards and saying, I didn't say anything in that moment. That was a difficult interaction. How do you feel right now? How would you like me to handle that going forward?
I love that he asked you to, because one, you might not have even realized exactly what you did want in that scenario. So it does give you that opportunity again to sort of explore how you feel about the situation and how you would in the future. But also because I have to assume we're all very different. There are going to be some women that want to stand up for themselves and are ready for that, and feel that maybe someone else standing up for them makes them look weaker or look like less. So I love that just asking you what you wanted opened up a whole new thought process for you, and probably also for the director, because he's learning from you as well at the same time that you're learning from him, and everybody's learning from the situation.
Exactly. And the idea that he's training us, and we're eventually going to be out on our own. So we have to make those decisions, how to interact, because, I'm fortunate now I have a male colleague again, but if I were the only provider in my clinic as a chiropractor, I may not have the option to say, particularly in the VA system, you're going to go see another chiropractor. I just may be stuck seeing this patient. There's other avenues to explore if it gets really extreme, but you have to be able to, establish, like you said, those boundaries and the way that you're going to respond to it. And you can start doing that when you have a supportive system around you.
Yeah, and I'd say it's really valuable to address this before it ever even happens, right? So for us during our training, we never really addressed it at the beginning. Like, hey, this is something that sometimes happens. This is how it may present sometimes, and think about how you would want to address it, right? And that never really happened for us. And I don't think it's to the fault of our directors or to the fault of anyone, but it's just never a spoken about topic. And so it's never gotten the publicity or really gotten acknowledged as it should. And so it's important to, I think, when you're bringing on new associates or having a student shadow you or come in for an internship, it's valuable as a doctor who's a bit at a higher rank, or even, person to person, to just say, sometimes this happens. Sometimes patients make inappropriate comments or do inappropriate things, and it's fine to address it and to think about, oh, would that be too far for me or would that not? And I think really what it comes down to is just sharing when it happens to the people that you feel like you want to talk to about it. Because there's many times that Dr. Holleran and I will come out of a room and say, oh, this patient just said this. And there's been times where patients have said to me as an Asian American female, your English is so good. And for me, it's just another comment, and I don't even address it because it's not worth it for me to put in the energy to address it. But I came out of the room and said that to my attending, who is another female, who is white, and then to Stephanie. And both of them were like, how dare he say something like that? Like, why would he ever think that that's appropriate? And for me, it was no big deal, right? But for them, they understood, and I understand the context behind it, right? You're thinking that because I'm Asian, I'm an immigrant, and my English isn't supposed to be good, but I grew up in California, and I was born and raised. And so really, if my English isn't good, it's because it's a reflection of my education in California versus me being from Asia. And so I think it's just really valuable to share those experiences and to talk about it, make it okay to talk about, so that the next time it happens, you're thinking, okay, this is maybe how I should respond, or this is not weird from a 90-year-old veteran that says darling to me, right? It's meant as a nice term and I'm just going to drop it. But when a patient who's 25 or 30 or 40 and calls me darling and then asks me out on a date, or says, oh, your husband is so lucky to have you, and is going down that avenue, then I would feel like having previous examples and previous times where my mentors have told me how they've responded, it would really help me in how I could respond.
So absolutely, first off, and let's talk a little bit about when it crosses the line, like you just mentioned. Obviously knowing that difference is huge, whether it's just a little subtle comment meant without malice, or what if they are trying to kind of lean the wrong way. I kind of want to talk about some damage control right now. So first and foremost, I personally document every little thing that happens. Because I love documentation. I know that's really strange to say out loud.
So important.
It really is. And I've had the pleasure of like getting to see both good and bad throughout practice, just when it's worth it to have that solid documentation. And I've seen some really horrible situations where people wished that they had it. So even me personally, even when it is a medium, moderate comment, I will still kind of throw in there, patient did use a comment today during conversation that was mild to moderately inappropriate. The patient was confronted and he apologized. I'll just throw something in there like, hey, this happened. And then obviously if it's far more severe, I'm documenting that like to a T. For me, the documentation is important. Do you think that from a law enforcement standpoint or from a clinical standpoint, it's important? I know for me personally, it just kind of allows me to sleep at night. But do you think that that's important for everyone to do?
I think it's important, particularly for, the moderate to severe repeat offenders. So if you have, like Dr. Lee said, a 90-year-old gentleman comes in, he calls you darling. If it bothers you and you talk to him and he never does it again, then, don't really need to document that. But if you have someone, come in and say something extremely inappropriate or repetitively is asking you out or trying to friend you on social media or sending you a message on social media. I know we've had this conversation in the past before with colleagues that if you do get a message on social media or an email, the feeling is to delete it or get rid of it because it feels gross and icky to like hang on to it. And it's like this constant reminder of that. But you need to take at least a screenshot of it and save it somewhere and document it, because if that progresses to something more severe like stalking or actual like sexual assault, you need to have that documentation ready for police to show that, it's not just your word against theirs. As far as documenting the clinic, I think, again, it would be up to your discretion. I would recommend, if it made you feel that uncomfortable that you're questioning if you should document it, you probably should. There's no harm in documenting something. There could potentially be a problem if you don't document it. So I think that depends on how much detail, whether or not you want to say the exact phrase that they said and what their response was, whether you just want to say, like you said, some patient made, mild to moderately inappropriate comment, talk to them, they apologized. That's fine as well.
I'd like to say that Stephanie and I have really struggled to find clear support in terms of documentation in when we've prepared our presentations on how we would address sexual harassment. And I think it's very clinic by clinic or environment by environment. Here in the VA, where both Dr. Holleran and I treat patients, our patients see their notes whenever they want. And so we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about the way that we document things. And I'd say that it's not quite their medical history. And so for us, I wouldn't put it in a patient's note. And I would say, yeah, you can create even just a different file or a form, right, where you fill it out and it just gets saved into a file and it's there if you need to go back and look at it again or pull it up if there's a repeat offender. But I think wherever you are, you should set up a system for your clinic on how to document these types of situations.
Speaking of systems, I thought this was really interesting. I have a lot of friends that work in the ED, the emergency department, and I thought it was really cool how they do this, not only with just sexual harassment, but also the way that they flag patients for tons of other things like suicidal ideations, aggression, and those kinds of things. They have a color-coded system, and I'm sure most hospitals probably have this, but they have a color-coded system and then a flag that pops up in their EMR. And it's not necessarily in the SOAP note or in the chart of the patient, but it's in the system. So anytime that patient gets admitted, it instantly just red flag, red flag, red flag, or whatever color it is. And then the wording pops up every time anyone interacts with that patient. So it's warning techs, it's warning nurses, it's warning physicians. And I thought that was really, really cool. And I didn't really, I guess I should have assumed that it worked like that. But to hear that made me feel comfortable in knowing that, okay, my friends, they kind of know what they're walking into, which if someone is a repeat offender, it's really good to know that, because especially in a place like the ED, they can probably come back.
Yeah. And so, and the challenge with the ED too, is, how emergent is their condition? How much time do you really have or to tell them, you're being inappropriate or hand off their treatment? Like if they're emergent, the risk and the benefit of stopping them and telling them that they're being appropriate, for either they may not be, sexually harassing you. They're probably going to be trending more towards, racial discrimination, something against sexual orientation or gender. But you can't really say like, no, I'm the only resident on duty for ortho, and I'm not going to treat this person because they offended me. So that's an additional challenge with ED. But as far as the flags go, we actually have that in VA as well, as far as suicidal risk or, if they have behavioral complaints, they'll get flagged at different levels for how severe their behavioral problems are. We have some patients in VA who have to check in with the police whenever they're on campus because they have been reprimanded enough times.
Well, and if any providers are listening who are not working in a hospital setting, it's kind of good to hear and realize that that's a thing, because you can still do that in your office if you do have an electronic health record system. There are ways that you can put in flags. Maybe they can't be color coded, but you can have something pop up when a patient who is inappropriate in any way walks in. I know personally with my staff, all of my assistants are female. And whenever I have had a male patient or any patient in general that's just a little inappropriate or is a repeat offender or just something is a little unique and potentially dangerous, I'll actually let them know that so that they're also in the loop. They probably didn't need to know that man made a sexual comment toward me during treatment today. But because they now know, if they're ever interacting with him alone, or they have to do some form of exam on him, take x-rays of him alone in a small room in the back, corner of the office, at least they kind of know. And I think as a female or in general, if you're with a patient alone, it's good to know who you need to be a little bit more cautious around.
You guys touched a couple times on your experiences at the VA, and now that I'm sitting here realizing all three of you have actually worked with the VA, so I'm feeling a little sore right now. No, Dr. Beck is now in private practice, and we're all having new experiences, I think, in our careers, but I'm curious to see what the differences are a little bit in handling situations like this when it comes to the point where you've decided that you need to release that patient from care. Like you were talking about earlier, Steph, it kind of sometimes you're going to be the only provider seeing that patient. You don't have a choice. You are the doc, right? And you can't pass them off like I did to my male colleague because I just didn't want to deal with that anymore, right? So in private practice, you might have the alternative feeling of, well, I don't want to create a bad name for my business, or I can't afford to lose that patient monetarily, or maybe just you have a big heart and you're really concerned that that patient's not going to get the care that they need anywhere else. And maybe it'll disturb that whole patient's treatment plan. So I want to explore a little bit some of the depths of what you go through to make those decisions and what's in place to support you in deciding to release a patient from care. What do you have to do to make that transition smooth and professional and help them get the care they need?
Dr. Holleran, I think, will give a fantastic answer for this, but I do want to just preface something that if it becomes a situation where you're losing sleep at night or it's affecting your attitude or your manner around the patient, it is more important to protect yourself and to make sure that you're sound and balanced, and it's not something that you're taking home when you're done with work, than to keep trudging through it and dealing with this patient that's not, changing despite you addressing whatever is happening. And then I'll just leave it at that. And then Dr. Holleran, I'm sure, will have a wonderful, eloquent answer to this.
Well, I don't know how eloquent it will be because it's kind of a challenge, right? Depending on the profession and depending on the state you're in, each board is going to have different requirements, or potentially, your malpractice may have guidance on what the requirements are for your state to actually dismiss a patient. So if you're in a practice with multiple providers and you have the option to, give that patient to another provider so that the practice in general doesn't lose that income or that money, that would be one way to do that. I think that, having that conversation ahead of time so that if you are an independent contractor and you are getting a certain percentage of collections, maybe making a trade of patients might be possible, or you get the next, walk-in patient to the clinic to support, to have that person supported in giving up that patient for their own safety. If you're in private practice by yourself and you're really concerned about money and you feel like you're not losing sleep over it, you just don't like this person, they're making you uncomfortable, but you can tolerate them, having a chaperone in the room might be an option. If you have a chiropractic assistant or PA or a nurse or someone who's around you who could stand in maybe for the treatment time, having an additional person present might make them less inclined to make comments depending on the patient. And then, just firing the patient in general. That is not the type of patient that you want to have in your clinic. That's not the type of environment that you want to encourage. And if they're a repeat offender and they're really making you uncomfortable, get rid of them and make room for someone else. If they go out and give you a bad name, I'm sure the people who they are talking to know their personality and may be able to, understand why they may have been fired. Or if they don't understand, then, you probably don't want those people in your clinic either.
So true.
So I was going to ask if you recommend firing verbally. Do you recommend firing via email, via letter? Is there a right way?
Well, since I have never been in private practice before, I'm not the best person to ask. I think that probably it depends on what level of safety and what the situation is. It may be best to fire via letter or telephone call, followed up by a letter. But I would probably recommend, for documentation purposes, that you have something in writing that says exactly why they're being, dismissed from the clinic. You can give them other clinics to go to, hopefully male run clinics, but you can give them other clinics to go to, and then, sign it and keep a copy for yourself. Send a copy to the patient so that it's all on record in case they try to bring you up for abandonment.
I actually did have a situation in private practice where we did have to fire a patient for a situation with someone else who worked in the office. And that is what we did. And we actually emailed the patient and also sent them documentation for them to sign acknowledging that we were terminating their care, but we encouraged them to seek care elsewhere. And that's exactly what we did. We gave them a list of male providers that we felt they would be safe and comfortable with and also receive good care. And they could sign and return it if they wanted to, which would be great. If not, we had it all documented that we did it anyway. So it really didn't matter. And it worked out well. And we actually did end up finding out later on that that person was receiving care somewhere else. So it was a really clean cut. And it was great, which was really nice.
Yeah, and I would just recommend checking in with your malpractice insurance to see how they might recommend you dismissing a patient, because I think state by state, there's different rules on abandonment, and it's always just important to make sure that you're doing what is appropriate and transferring that care or allowing them to have providers that can continue the care that. Yeah, it's just important to check in with your state and with your malpractice insurance for some guidance as well.
They may even have templates or other resources that can help as well. And we'll certainly try to hunt some of those down too, because we always have resources available after all our podcasts anyway. So we're going to be doing some hunting there too. And today we've talked a lot about how this affects females in practice. And this year, before everything got a little too crazy in our world, earlier this year, all four of us were actually up in Washington, D.C. for a conference. And I was excited to sit on a panel with Dr. Lee and Dr. Holleran. And the room was packed, and it was on this topic. And the coolest part is it was really equal men and women in the whole room. And not only was it packed, and there were tons of great comments and questions and discussions afterwards, and people sharing personal stories, so much so that we actually got shushed and then had to move out into the hallway where we all continued talking about it. That's how needed this topic is. But one of the most interesting things that I think we all found were that most of the guys in the room had similar experiences, maybe not to the extent or frequency that a lot of the women had, but almost all of them had experienced something. And so they were there to learn how to protect their female colleagues, but also how to approach and handle these situations themselves. So we could probably talk for a whole nother, 7 episodes on this for men too, but I would like to know a little bit about how a male provider should handle situations like these. Should they handle them the same way or differently? What have you found?
I think they could be handled similarly. I think that we hear about them less often, or at least this is what I've heard from some of my male colleagues. We hear about them less often, and they find them less threatening, because typically, women are smaller than men. They're less threatening than men. And so there's that physical attribute of males that males could, attack a female and become more dominant. And it's scarier as a female. And, a lot of times females aren't believed as often, whereas, males can sometimes laugh it off more, although it's still, it's very challenging as a clinician and being male, because you don't want to be too aggressive responding to those females. who are, making inappropriate comments. So I think that it could be handled, in the same manner, not acknowledging it, telling the female that it is unwelcomed, or addressing it in the same way where you said, I think it's you're trying to give me a compliment, and I don't appreciate that. I'd rather focus on the work that we're doing. Would probably be the best way. Unfortunately, I think there's even less evidence, if there's any evidence out there, as far as male providers being sexually harassed by their female patients.
Right. I think it's important to include them and let them know that it is possible, and we're here for them too. And we understand that it's out there in so many ways, shapes, and forms. Well, honestly, guys, this has been an awesome conversation today. And you guys, again, like Dr. Mack said, we could talk about this forever. But we just thank you so much for your time. And before we wrap up here in just a minute or so, I was just curious personally as to why you two became so passionate about this topic. How did this arise? How did you two join forces and start to dig into research and start presenting on this topic? You can tell you guys care about this a lot, and I love that. And it's a much needed topic. So how did this kind of all start for you two?
Yeah, so really it started with us experiencing it firsthand and talking about it with each other. And we oftentimes go back to the evidence when we're thinking about how to care for our patients, right? We get a patient with a diagnosis we don't really understand. We look it up and trying to find some evidence that helps guide us in how to treat the patient or to understand the physiology better. I think we kind of just took that approach as well to try and see what was out there to guide us in terms of the evidence and to see how often it happened. And there really was nothing. And I mean, for me, during my education, I don't think it was ever really talked about at all. And I remember one vague instance where it happens to one of my colleagues who was in student clinic as well, but it was kind of a hush-hush thing and was taken care of, and then it was over. And I think it was a really big learning opportunity that was missed. And so for me, we had that momentum from an experience, unfortunately, but it kind of just kept the conversation going and kept the movement forward to the point where we decided to learn more about it, to reach out to those who had more experience so they could teach us, and to start to share it with other friends and colleagues, because we started to realize that it is something that a lot of people deal with.
So like I had kind of talked about earlier, it also had to do with the fact that, we had such a supportive director. We learned so much in clinic from Dr. Anthony Lacey, and not just as a clinician, but as how to approach even these types of clinical situations that aren't taught in the classroom. And part of our conversation that day was about how many women out there are practicing both in chiropractic and other health professions that are trying to help people and don't know how to respond to these events. And may even, there's some people who even leave the profession because they're so uncomfortable and they feel so violated and they don't feel like there's anyone there to support them. And how could we get that information out? And, after we presented in Washington, D.C. at the ACA's annual meeting, and having that response that we had there, we realized how important it was to get this out even further and try to actually do a lot more work and get more evidence to show that the prevalence and how big of an issue this is. And so what happened is just a conversation, and an intern office at the VA in Connecticut, turned into a year and a half later, we're still trying to get people to hear more about it.
Well, I love what you guys are doing, and I believe that your eventual goal, I think, is to start diving into getting the information, obviously, out there to providers, but also to maybe dive into the educational system and the educational side of things and start implementing ways that this could be added to the curriculum. Because I agree with you. I never really talked about this at all during my training either. And that's exactly why Better Doctor Project is what it is and why we decided to create this, because there are a lot of things we need to be able to know and utilize as providers that we just aren't going to get in a classroom. Some things absolutely should be in a classroom, and some things we just need to take a deeper dive into understanding. And this is a great way to do it, to have people like you who are passionate about these things. And I look forward to everything you two are going to do. And I think the sky's the limit, and people are ready for this information, and you could take it literally anywhere.
Well, we appreciate you giving us another platform to get the information out and kind of share some of the, things that we have found to be beneficial as far as our own ways of addressing sexual harassment.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Hey guys, Dr. Mac here. I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode because, as you can see, there are so many different types of scenarios and situations that can occur when it comes to patient-initiated sexual harassment. And a lot of the framework that we talked about here also applies to other situations where one might experience sexual harassment as well. Of course, for all of our amazing providers listening in, we wanted to focus this specifically as to what you might experience in your offices, hospitals, or areas of practice. So we hope today's episode really helped you feel confident in being able to tackle these difficult situations as soon as they arise, whether it's for you, a colleague, or an employee. As we talked about before, you never know when these scenarios are going to arise, and oftentimes they come as a surprise. So make sure to share this episode and all the tangible resources that you can find on our website with all of your friends, colleagues, and many other healthcare providers who may find themselves in these situations. Let's make sure we know how to handle them positively and keep our patients on track. We loved connecting with you today on this episode of the Better Doctor Project. We can't wait to share our next podcast with you in just 2 weeks. Same time, same place. Until then, pop over to Instagram to follow us at Better Doctor Project or keep up with us at betterdoctorproject.com.
Thank you for tuning in to the Provider's Report. We hope you found today's episode valuable and inspiring. To stay updated with our latest episodes, subscribe to our podcast wherever you like to listen. For more resources and continuing education opportunities, visit our website. Together, we can make a difference in the lives of our patients and truly set a standard for value-based healthcare.